This sermon is actually called Finding Arrowheads. From the first grade through senior year of high school, I lived with my family at 42 Myannis Road, named for a sachem, or chief, of what historians have called the Sewanese tribe of the Wappinger Confederacy in New Canaan, Connecticut. The name Myannis means he who gathers together. To get to my elementary school, you took a right turn on Wahakme Road, and then a left on Ponus Ridge named for another chief who had a monument named for him at the intersection of Ponus Ridge Road and Davenport Ridge Road. Our school bus went right by the beautiful granite monument every day. And for those who are interested in American architecture, you may recognize the street and the town name as also being the location of the famous glass house built by Philip Johnson. We played in the woods a lot as kids, and one of the big activities, aside from collecting leaves and moss to make potions and catching frogs, was to look for arrowheads. They were so cool. We held them and we talked about, is that really an arrowhead or is it just a rock that looks kind of like one? We passed them reverently around. If you found a really good one, you could bring it to show and tell at school or maybe donate it to the nature center. Indians, that is what we called indigenous people then, and what many Native American people still call themselves, captured my imagination. I thought about how they lived so confidently in the woods, in simple shelters, while we all seemed to need so much house around us, and how quietly I had heard they were able to track animals while hunting in the woods. I knew from the movies that they wore skins and feathers, but I didn't know what they had worn in cold New England winter. I would look out the window while sitting in my classroom and wonder where the Indians went. I assumed they all went somewhere by choice, moved somewhere. I never thought or wondered why or how that happened. I just felt really disappointed that I didn't know any Indians. My dad and I belonged to a group called Indian Princesses, a program for fathers and daughters to do outdoorsy types of things and to engage in what I now know was really cringeworthy cultural appropriation. We all chose Indian names for ourselves. I was Feather something. And my father, with his prominent proboscis, decided to go by Eagle Beak. This was funny at the time, but knowing what I do now, less funny. I think, Dad, your own people were also victims of genocide. Why did we think it was okay to engage in this jokey behavior, these caricatures of cultures that were intentionally decimated? It was also at that time that the Keep America Beautiful campaign produced a commercial featuring an Indian who paddles to the shore in a canoe and cries at the sight of people throwing trash out onto the highway. You remember that? Remember the tear when he turns to the camera? That was actually an Italian actor who got a lot of roles playing Native Americans. Hollywood had not engaged in ethical questioning about its casting practices. A romantic image of the noble savage archetype. That was all the positive representation I ever saw of Indians as a youth. What indigenous leaders, poets, activists, teachers have been trying to communicate to people of European heritage for a long time is that they don't want or need to be romanticized and treated as a source of spiritual or cultural inspiration or mockery or theft from the past, but respected as an important and valued part of America's present. Stephen Charleston, an Indigenous elder and also an Episcopal priest and bishop, reminds us that Native Americans didn't get citizenship until 1924, and that it was assumed they would go extinct before they got to go to the polls. Surviving in the shadows of colonialism, he writes, we have a deep experience of maintaining hope and striving for justice. We have passed through the valley of genocide and emerged to help others face their struggles with hope and determination. Consequently, we are not a historic artifact of American history. Instead, we are the people of tomorrow, the people who have seen the light of renewal and never stopped climbing to reach it. Not a historical artifact. I realized at some point in my adulthood that Indigenous Americans had been so erased from New England culture, where I've spent most of my life, that I had unconsciously been thinking of them as a nostalgic subject, and that I needed to intentionally address that. I needed to stop looking for arrowheads and start looking for ways to learn about the lives and experiences of Native Americans today. I started reading novels, poetry, and plays by Native Americans, seeing films directed and written by them about their community, following stories about their political struggles, which often don't make it into our mainstream news media, attending lectures on cultural theft, the terrible history of how Indigenous children were essentially stolen from their families and schooled by English-speaking colonists who punished them for speaking their languages and practicing their religion, fishing and hunting rights, land use, so many struggles going on today, a whole world of tradition, art, ritual, and reverence. What is generally referred to as Native American spirituality is very popular among Unitarian Universalists and many other people who experience the earth as a living and souled being. But there's a moral problem if we turn to those sources without acknowledging the people whose cultures produced this ancient and enduring wisdom, this worldview. And when our knowledge of their stories is limited to those told by colonizers and conquerors, I know that we are still undoing what we learned about Christopher Columbus and what we learned about Pocahontas and looking for what really happened. When I was in Amarillo, Texas in 2009, I spent the day hiking in Palo Duro Canyon, and I was so depressed to see that the exhibits at the Visitor Center described the Red River War, a military campaign to displace the Plains Indians, was being presented purely in terms that supported the government's aggression against the Indians. The exhibit in 2009 still assumed that everyone who came to see the beautiful natural formation of the canyon would fall right in line with the racist cowboys and Indians tropes and go away thinking of the site as a place where the good guys won, rather than understanding it as one of the many locations where genocide of the original inhabitants of these lands was attempted. If we're going to admire what we call Native American spirituality, we can't do that ethically without being in solidarity with that diverse, complex, and struggling community and its history. How do we do so? By making sure that if we are not of Native American lineage, we listen to those who are. By being willing to hear what survival has been like and looks like to the very people whose ancestors wrote those prayers, blessings, and chants that have, for instance, appeared in our hymnal, but whose context we may not ever have considered. We do that by being aware of the appropriation of Native American aesthetic that has led to insults, or what we call microaggressions, against Native American people. You know, I think about the sort of boho look with the feathers in the hair. Well, feathers in the hair as a Native American, symbol, it has symbolic, very important spiritual meaning. So that's just one example. Or people who dress up at Halloween, you know. We do it by opening our eyes to the history of genocide, how it is embedded in and accepted in our institutions. For example, when I attended Harvard Divinity School, there was still a very active fight going on over the human remains of Native American people at the Peabody Museum on campus. This is a struggle that continues despite the fact that the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act passed in 1990. So this is still a very active issue. Your own grandparents' bones, their remains on display in a museum. In the 1980s, there were all kinds of New Age programs, you might remember this, led by white people calling themselves shamans, who led other white people on warrior weekends involving sweat lodge, and graduating them as shamanic leaders. Congratulations, you paid $200 and did a warrior weekend and you're a shaman. By now there's been enough, I hope, conversation and education led by Indigenous people to explain why this isn't just problematic but unethical, and I hope it's going on a lot less. A lot of this kind of spiritual appropriation happened in our own UU communities. As I mentioned before, in our hunger for earth-centered spiritual ancestors and sources, Unitarian Universalists made serious mistakes, assuming permissions to use that which was not ours to claim as ours. And what Native American leaders always say is, people of European descent have your own indigenous traditions. Just keep going back. You'll find them in your own ancestry. It's hard to draw an accurate analogy, but it seems to me akin to entering the house where there was once a mass murder by your own government and helping yourself with great gusto to the meal the inhabitants have left on the table and in their pantry. This food is amazing. It's so delicious, nutritious too, and never questioning, never asking, what happened to these people? Why aren't they here at home? What can we do for their living children and family members? We talk a lot as a church about the difference between covenant and consumerism. In this context, our covenantal commitments bid us not to just consume beautiful aspects of Indigenous culture without sharing Indigenous people's struggle for truth-telling and for justice. Fond appreciation for the passing of peace pipes is not enough knowledge or awareness. American poet laureate Joy Harjo, 3 ghost figures. The past rose up before us and cried in the voices of the children who were dragged to Indian school and never returned. The present spoke up, and those who remembered how to listen could hear. We offered tobacco and paid attention to their stories. The future was a path through soldiers with Gatling guns and GMO-spoiled crops, motioning us to safety. I rode on a bus or biked by the monument erected to honor Chief Ponis of the Ripawam peoples 1,000 times. No one ever told me that he had been shot and killed by a white settler. It doesn't say it anywhere on the monument either. St. Paul wrote long ago in a letter to the community in Corinth, "When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things." Princess Whatever Feather, who prowled the woods looking for Indian arrowheads and Indian graves, with respect in her heart and appreciation for most everything she later learned about the spiritual worldview of the people who had first lived where she lived and played and hunted frogs and trick-or-treated or babysat, jumped on the trampoline, picked flowers, had to become an adult and enter into a more honest and responsible relationship with those people whose ghosts inhabited the land and whose children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren live here still. She had to learn, I had to learn, that they are not ghosts, but living communities, people not of the past, but of the present and the future, who are fighting to be heard today, fighting for the earth, and representing a worldview that was violently suppressed, but is most desperately needed in our quest for mutual survival. I will end with the words of Robin Wall Kimmerer, Indigenous environmental scientist and nature writer. She writes, "The earth, that first among good mothers, gives us the gift that we cannot provide ourselves. I hadn't realized that I had come to the lake and said, 'Feed me,' but my empty heart was fed. I had a good mother. She gives what we need without being asked. I wonder if she gets tired, old Mother Earth, or if she too is fed by the giving." "Thanks," I whispered, "for all of this."
Singing Everything by Joy Harjo. Once there were songs for everything. Songs for planting and growing and harvesting, for eating, getting drunk, falling asleep, for sunrise, birth, and mind break and war. For death, those are the heaviest songs, and they have to be pried from the earth with shovels of grief. Now all we hear are falling in love songs and falling apart after falling in love songs. The earth is leaning sideways, and a song is emerging from the floods and fires. Urgent tendrils lift toward the sun and must be friends with silence to hear. The songs of the guardians of silence and the most powerful, they are the most rare.